Okay, very good. So let's get started. Welcome to the virtual colloquium series In Conversation, Art Museums as Institutions for Wellbeing, organized by the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project at the University of Pennsylvania. My name is James Pelowski, and I'm Professor of Practice and Director of Education in the Positive Psychology Center at Penn, and the founding director of the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project, which I will often refer to as HHF. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to those who are joining us live and to those who are watching the recorded version of today's event. The mission of the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project is to understand, assess, and advance the well-being benefits of engagement in arts and culture, focusing on individual and collective human flourishing. We're grateful for the support from the Chris and Sasha Heinz Family Foundation, the Heinz Endowments, and the National Endowment for the Arts, which has designated the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project as an NEA research lab, and is supportive both of practice-informed research and of research-informed practice in the arts, culture, and well-being. You can find out much more about HHF, including our publications and how to sign up for our newsletter, on our website at www.humanitiesandhumanflourishing.org, which has just been placed in the chat. Today, we are thrilled to continue with our second installment of In Conversation, part of the HHF Colloquium series, and consisting of a series of conversations between scientists and practitioners on topics concerning the arts, culture, and well-being. This fall, the theme of In Conversation is Art Museums as Institutions for Well-being, featuring sessions with scientific researchers and art museum innovators. There's robust research indicating that attendance at art museums can increase well-being. In our own research, spearheaded by Catherine Cotter, art museum professionals identified gaps between what art museums are doing and what they should be doing. The greatest such gap they identified was in well-being. Art museum professionals believe art museums should be doing much more to support visitor well-being, but they also indicated that they do not feel equipped to do so successfully. This colloquium series is intended as a step toward helping art museum professionals and anyone else with an interest in this area to think about the roles art museums do and can play in supporting well-being. Before we turn to our two distinguished speakers for today, let me preview the plan for this colloquium. We will begin by hearing a 20-minute presentation from each speaker in turn. Then I will moderate a brief discussion with the speakers before opening it up to a Q&A with all of you. I would ask that you hold your questions until the end, and when I indicate that we are ready for Q&A, raise your Zoom hand if you have a question you would like to pose or a comment you would like to make. And with that, let's turn to our speakers. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Matthew Pelowski. Dr. Pelowski is Assistant Professor of Cognitive and Neuroaesthetics in the Faculty of Psychology at the University of Vienna, with a dual affiliation in the Vienna Cognitive Science Hub. He is the head of the ARTIS Lab, which stands for Art Research on Transformation of Individuals and Society, which sounds pretty darn good, and is currently the coordinator for an EU Horizon 2020 consortium project called Transformations, Societal Challenges and the Arts, combining 9 research institutions and social partners in psychology and neuroscience, art education, and arts policy, with a specific focus on the efficacy of arts-based initiatives for changing attitudes, behaviors, and health. Please join me in welcoming Matthew Pelowski.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I'm going to try to share my screen here. See. Can you see it? Everything looks okay?
Looks great.
Great. Okay. And I set my timer because I've been warned to fit the 20 minutes. So yeah, I'm very honored to be here. Very excited to get the chance to talk about this project and even more to have a conversation around this topic. And because the introduction was so nice, I won't tell you again who I am, but when it comes to the question and answer portion, by all means, if you have any questions, I'm really looking forward to answering them. But I think I'll start with a quote that for me sort of encapsulates what I want to talk about today, and was touched upon just in this introduction now, which is from the British Minister for the Arts, Estelle Morris, in 2003, when she said, "I know that arts and culture make a contribution to health, to education, to crime reduction, strong communities, to the nation's well-being, but I don't know how to evaluate it or describe it." And really what I want to share with you today is just some of the work we're doing in this direction, and some of the evidence that we've put together, and a bit of where we hope to go in the future. And really, there we go. Because we do have two speakers, and because I think what sets some of what we're doing a bit apart is what I really want to focus on today is the second half of this quote on the more societal, or in this case, nation-focused aspects. As was mentioned, there is really exciting, good evidence emerging that the arts can be used in a number of contexts, especially to mediate well-being as it's understood in terms of our physical well-being, our mental well-being in hospitals and museums, mediating mood, mediating anxiety or loneliness. And recently, I think this was nicely put together by a scoping survey by Daisy Fancourt and also by the WHO, really showing thousands of studies putting together evidence that this can work. At the same time, and the point of departure for what I want to talk about today, I think there's so many other uses of art that arise in really human history. So thinking way back to maybe the rise of art, art has always been a core aspect of what makes us human, of our cultures, of our identity, of the way we come together as communities. It can, of course, give us very profound, powerful experiences. It might change our beliefs, our understanding of very important events. Maybe it can lead to increased empathy, to increased understanding. And I will note that this is, of course, not overlooked by even, say, the WHO. They note health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. But as I'll talk about today, I think it's still this second half that is still a bit overlooked, especially when we get into empirical research, and it's what our project is really trying to do. And just, of course, we can move this into present examples. For example, a piece by Ai Weiwei, where he affixed life jackets from refugees that had washed up on, I believe, a Greek island to the pillars in front of the concert house or the concert hall in Berlin, or a piece by Oliver Eliasson trying to raise awareness of climate change by putting pieces of an iceberg in front of Parliament buildings in Europe. Of course, it goes right into very contemporary events. This is a cartoon speaking to the events in Iran right now. And of course, one of my favorite examples is a poster campaign about anti-Brexit by Wolfgang Tillmans, trying to get people to not vote for Brexit. But of course, we know also that it doesn't always work. We know that, for example, in the Brexit campaign example, the UK still voted to leave. And we know that there's other examples where there's just, it gets a bit wishy-washy. We don't really have strong evidence of, is this working? In what cases is it working? And even how do we start to understand it? And this leads to any number. I just did a bit of a Google deep dive for headlines of various articles. Can art really make a difference? Why don't the arts do anything? Or eventually, when we move to the policy side of things, if we don't really have good tangible evidence of, does this work? In what ways does it work? Can we really change people's minds and attitudes? It raises the questions of, well, why should we pay for it? If the arts aren't doing anything at these levels, why should we fund giant biennales or giant exhibitions or various uses of art that is supposed to speak to various contemporaneous events? And I would also mention one of the points of departure for our project is that why would we expect all cases of art and all interactions to lead to these big events. I think one of the things we have to grapple with, especially as psychologists, is that quite often, this is probably what happens most often when we're engaging art, especially in a museum. We spend about 10 to 40 seconds, we may not even pay any attention, and we move on. And the question is, how do we put all these pieces together, and how do we really understand what can the arts do in speaking to these societal challenges? And that is the point of departure for this project. As was mentioned, this is an EU project that started about 2 years ago, and it was funded in a transformation scheme, which is a plan by the EU looking for specific funding opportunities and specific topics. And in this case, they were very interested in a team to address this issue of, can the arts be put towards societal challenges, and specifically behavioral or attitude change? And this was, some of the work I'll talk about today is our answer to that. And I won't go into the consortium, but essentially we have a really exciting opportunity for the next several years to work with various partners in various institutions, especially in museums, but also on the street, in people's homes, and looking at what is the transformative power of art. And essentially what we do, I'll just say 3 things. We track experience across Europe in museums, galleries, the street, everyday lives. We try to quantify and assess art engagements and their implications, especially at the level of attitudes and behavior. And then eventually, one of the things we're hoping to do in the future, and if anyone has any great ideas, let me know, we are working with artists, with curators, with policy practitioners to understand, articulate, but also to foster and hopefully co-create the transformative potential of art. And so that leads us a bit into just some examples that I want to give you of what we're doing. But I think the best way to start is to do a brief dive into theory, because I think one of the aspects that sets our project a bit apart is it is driven by some theoretical work that we've done, especially looking at transformative experience. And actually this was work that I started doing in my own PhD. It was what got me interested in this topic to begin with, looking at, can we start to explain what does it look like at a psychological level when art is transformative? And we've since updated this into newer versions where we try to connect it to various types of experience. And I won't, again, go into the details, but I do want to give you a little gist of at least what we're speaking about. So we've basically come up with a model of what happens when we engage art. And it starts, I think, one of the important parts, it starts with a sense of who we are and the expectations we have even before we go into an art encounter. And we talk about, say, the self-image. Who am I? What is art? How does art relate to me? What is the context? What do I expect? What is my worldview? And of course, this doesn't have to be art related. It could be about anything. What do I think about the climate crisis? What do I think about the sort of car that I want to buy? But what we can do is we can form this into a rather hierarchical model of the self. And this actually gives us a mechanism to talk about transformation. And we can say, okay, at the core, at the very top, we probably have these strong beliefs of who we are. And various researchers call these the ideal self-image or B goals. So I should be X. I should be a good person. I should be a successful student. I should be a good psychologist. And then we can apply these down at lower and lower levels. For example, in a specific context, how should I act? What should I do? With specific micro decisions, how should I act? What should I look for? And if you're interested in, say, predictive processing theories, I think it's largely arguing the same thing. But the argument would be the lower these are, the less really intrinsic they are to who you are and your sense of identity. And so they're probably quite easy to change. And as they get up higher, they're harder to change, but also maybe more transformative when they do. And then we basically argue that, okay, you take all of these expectations and schema with you, you meet something in the world, maybe it's a work of art, and you apply it. And we go through various processing stages that are pretty well defined by now of how we find different features, put them together. And then eventually this can lead to different outcomes. But the key point of what we're doing is we argue that in in the middle, we take this information that we've found and we basically go through three, we call them cognitive checks. And these are more theoretical, I think, than actually what's going on, say, in your brain. But there's three of them, and they're very important for sort of determining what sort of art experience do we have. And it's congruency, self-relevance, and coping need. So basically, how did what I'm doing match with what I expected to happen? Did this reinforce what I thought about myself and the world, or did it somehow call into question? Self-relevance, do I care? I mean, how much does it really matter to me whether or not I understand what's happening? And then eventually coping, how long do I have to stay here and put up with this if things don't go well? And I think the exciting thing is we can use this then as a model to look at, okay, well, what sort of experiences might we have when people do meet a work of art in a museum or in their lives? And we can say, okay, well, first of all, if you have low self-relevance, I don't care, and low discrepancy, I more or less found what I was looking for. That probably describes most situations. It's sort of, you see it, you see what you expected, you move on with your life. And we call this a facile outcome. On the other hand, you might have much higher self-relevance, but things do match what you expected. And in this case, especially when we talk about arts and health and well-being and anxiety or stress, I think this is particularly exciting because it basically suggests that you have this very resonant, self-reinforcing, some might even say like a flow type experience. Or you can have high self-relevance, I care, but at the same time, there's a discrepancy. Things don't really match. And in this case, one of two things can happen. First of all, in most cases, you might just get really angry. And I always like to use this example by Andres Serrano, which is the Piss Christ. It's a photograph. And what I always tell my students is in 2011 in France, someone was so angered by this photograph that they attacked it with a hammer. And I think from a psychological perspective, it's very interesting to think about how could this inanimate object make you so angry that you would do this radical act? And of course, you can talk about, well, it's a crucifix dipped in a jar of urine and a beautiful photo taken of it. And if you're, say, a very religious person, or in this case, Catholic person, this might be sacrilegious and it might make you very angry. But it's really, you can see in this mismatch of what you think the world should be and what you believe to be yourself, and an artwork that can lead to this reaction. And really in psychology, this response is quite common. We're very good at sort of getting ourselves out of situations that call a bit into question who we think we are. And we might talk about an idea called secondary control. So you run away, you basically devalue the situation, you say it doesn't matter, the artist is an idiot, it's not my fault. And then finally, and this is where the coping potential comes in, if you stick it out, and for some reason you don't leave, but you stay there, then I think that's the potential for transformation. And in this case, we have high self-relevance, but there is a discrepancy, and there is this need to cope and this need to stay. And actually, we would suggest that people go through a process of, at some point you become somewhat self-aware. You might find yourself thinking, what am I doing here? What did I expect? You might have very high self-awareness, or even take a metacognitive perspective. You sort of look at yourself in this situation and try to basically adapt your schema. So you have to change something about your model of the world in order to fit the situation. And that's what we would talk about as a transformation or a self-change. And as you can see in my example in the top right, basically something on the bottom starts a chain reaction and it changes something core about yourself. So the key points for some of the research I want to talk about is this gives us a framework for the kinds of outcomes and stages we expect. It should be universal. This is one of my arguments, and I get pushback on this quite a lot. So it's below the level of who, what, where, and we can really talk about probabilities. So we can say, okay, with this artwork, with this person and this personality and this set of expectations, and based on what they had for lunch maybe before they came, we would expect 20% of the time, they might have a transformative experience. 40% of the time, nothing would happen. And we can also talk about with a specific work of art across the population, this might be very transformative, this might be very harmonious. And I think that really leads into talk of the implications of what can happen when we engage the art. And finally, it gives us a roadmap of what we could look for. So we can start, a lot of the work we do, and I'll show you, is looking at emotions or phenomenal states. So we ask people after the fact, how did that feel? You know, did you feel anger? Did you feel confusion? Did you feel insight? And we can start to posit, okay, if you answer with this combination, we should be able to tell you what kind of experience you have. And that leads us to the museum work we're doing. So basically, we do all sorts of things, but the most basic is just using a survey. And we would choose a particular work of art that we think is compelling. We either stop people before or after or both and have them fill out a survey about their experience. And I'll just give you a few examples of what we're finding. So actually, I said Europe, but ironically, the first example I'll show you is in the US. And it's one of the first we looked at. It's the Rothko Chapel in Houston, Texas. And this was particularly interesting because it's just a large octagonal room with 14 purple paintings. But it's also argued that most people who have ever cried over 20th century art have done so in this room. And there's a lot of anecdotal discussions and accounts from critics, but also if you visit, which I've had the opportunity to do, and look at the guest book, there's these really interesting comments like find yourself. And the idea is in this particular room, you go in and you're hit with this overwhelming sense of meaning and importance, but it eventually becomes very clear that there really is no meaning in the art. It's just splotches and colors of paint, and people sort of find themselves alone in this space and then have to look within and deal with what's going on. And so what we've done is, for example, we can go in and we can stop them after the fact and we can say, okay, would you answer these 4 questions about how it felt? And based on their patterns of how they answer, we can really bin them in different experience types. So for example, people would say, I was not confused, I was not anxious, I was not self-aware, and I did not experience any insight or epiphany. And they would be really the meh or the facile case. They might also say, I was confused and anxious, but I didn't have these insightful or self-aware outcomes. And that would be a very negative case. Or they might say yes to everything. And the exciting thing is then we can match this to the implications of experience. So in this case, if you want people to say the art was good, they understood the intention, or they felt like crying, you really want this transformative outcome. We've also done this, for example, in the UK, in Japan, in the US, with very similar Rothko artworks. And we find the same patterns and also even the same percentages of incidence of these different outcomes. And I think going back to what is the importance of this, especially when we're talking about well-being, for example, you can start to look at, okay, if you ask people before and after, who are you? Am I good? Am I bad? Am I serious? Am I humorous? We find that there's is a positive change in your own self-image if you have this transformative experience. And that leads to a lot of the work we're doing. I only have a couple minutes, so I'll just give you a few examples. But we're basically duplicating this and looking at different events across Europe. Some of the work we did, especially during COVID, was in Berlin. Say, okay, well, what about art about climate change? And in this case, it was supposed to make you reflect on gold mining in Venezuela. And we stopped people again before they went into the gallery. And we could show that, yes, pre-post, there's this change in nature awareness, especially with transformative outcomes. But at the same time, if you look at the relationship between nature and the self, we find really interesting effects. And I think this is something maybe we can talk about in the future. So in this case, people after the experience would say, you know what, I'm not as integrated with nature as I thought I was. Another example, we actually did this with Catherine Cotter. Here she is standing in front of this gallery. This was an exhibition basically about refugees, if you will. And again, we could find that, yeah, it works. Xenophobia goes down, but at the same time, so does empathic concern. So people would say, you know what, I'm not as empathic as I thought I was. I'm less xenophobic, but I'm also there's this introspection. Finally, I'll just say, we've done studies recently, for example, in Documenta. And for the first time here, we asked if you could describe your own experience, which keyword would you use? And we gave the people the same keywords. Nobody says negative, which I found really interesting. But then when you look at, okay, if people say I had a transformative experience, and we ask them, do you think this experience made you a better person? They would say, yes, it actually goes up, especially compared to the other experience types. At the same time, going back to arts and health and classical well-being, if you say, did this make you feel better? You get an opposite effect. People who have a transformative experience actually feel worse at the time. And I think this is an interesting thing also we can talk about. And if I can steal like one more minute, I'll close it out. I'll just say that we do, of course, look at, can art make you feel better? We just published a paper actually looking at brief engagements with online art. In this case, we sent people to Google Arts and Culture and had them look at a Monet water lily. And we could find that, yeah, in this case, this is a very sort of harmonious experience. It reduces anxiety, it reduces loneliness, it makes you feel better. It increases your subjective well-being. We've also done this in the gallery, for example, with the same sort of Monet painting. But again, going back to this varieties and different outcomes of experience, here we know, this is based on the museum study, that this is a very harmonious experience and it's not really that transformative across our population of people. And we were curious, for example, well, what if you use a harmonious artwork? Maybe that's a better path to changing attitudes about, say, empathic concern, pro-socialness, xenophobia. And no, it doesn't work in the opposite direction either. You can make people feel better, but you don't, there's not evidence, at least in this case, that you would change their minds. And so just to conclude, yes, we should also consider the transformative potential of art at the level of the body, mind, but also actions and beliefs. Yes, this can be captured and assessed, and this was only a taste that I could give you, but I'm happy to talk forever about this. If I leave you with one key point, especially when we're talking about applying the arts, I think this raises important questions about different outcomes due to different experiences or types of art. And of course, it raises questions about next steps. We need more research. We need to talk about active mediation, understanding the limits of what can be accomplished, duration, dose. One project that we're putting together right now is working with the National Gallery in London to look at mediating people's expectations before they go into a gallery to lead to different sorts of experience outcomes. And I'll stop there, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthew. That was fantastic. Lots of wonderful and inspiring information there that we'll look forward to digging into in just a few minutes. At this point, I want to turn to our second speaker, Kate Mulligan. Dr. Mulligan is the Senior Director of the Canadian Institute for Social Prescribing, co-chair of the Global Social Prescribing Alliance, and a member of the Flourish Research Collaborative on Creativity, Arts, and Wellbeing. She is Assistant Professor in Social and Behavioral Health Sciences in the Dalla Lana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto, and Senior Advisor on Social Determinants of Health and Knowledge Mobilization for the Canadian Red Cross. Please join me in welcoming Kate Mulligan.
Thanks, James, and thank you so much, Matthew, for the wonderful talk. I'm going to talk to you about a deliberate way in which people are trying to connect individuals and communities to the arts for their well-being, and that's social prescribing, and in particular, arts on prescription. I'm going to talk about a particular project called the Canadian Institute for Social Prescribing that is funded by the Public Health Agency of Canada and anchored by the Canadian Red Cross. I want to begin by acknowledging the territory that I'm speaking from, and I'd like to encourage you to do the same. So please do reflect on the land you find yourself on at this moment. If you're so inclined, add it into the chat box. I am sitting on the territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation here in Toronto, Canada. This is home to many Indigenous people, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people from across my country, Canada, but also Indigenous people from around the world who are really leading the way when it comes to culture as medicine and have important leadership when it comes to social prescribing here in this country. So I want to acknowledge this territory, the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt territory, where we all share responsibility for taking care of resources around the Great Lakes region. So here in Canada, arts on prescription is a thing. If you're feeling isolated, you can now be prescribed a trip to the museum. We're starting to see this in the media, for example, that the art by prescription trend is growing here in Canada. This picture on the left from the Royal Ontario Museum was from an article published in 2019. And I would say it was the single most important milestone in social prescribing across Canada. It was on the front page of the Toronto Star, which is Canada's largest daily newspaper, and created a whole buzz of interest in social prescribing generally and arts on prescription in particular that continues to this day. So very briefly, social prescribing means a pathway between healthcare and community supports and services. This image comes from the World Health Organization in the Western Pacific region, and we worked closely with them on their toolkit for social prescribing and their online training for social prescribing that you can look up if you're interested in finding out more about the practice of social prescribing. But here's basically what it looks like. A healthcare provider assesses their patient for social needs that cannot be addressed very well within clinical healthcare. So these are health needs that are rooted in the social and structural determinants of health. It might be loneliness and social isolation. It might be requiring support to access affordable housing or healthy food. It might be something related to the arts and the need to participate and be with other people and engage in arts and culture. This person doesn't have to be in primary healthcare. They could be in a hospital. They could be in a long-term care facility. They don't even really have to be a healthcare provider. You could do a self-referral, but often this is what happens. There's a referral from healthcare to somebody who's known as a link worker. That person's job is to spend time with you, the participant. And really at this point, you wouldn't be called a patient anymore. You're a person. You're a person with needs, yes, but also with gifts, with assets, with something to offer, with relationships. And so you work with your link worker to develop a plan that makes sense for you, to help address some of those causes of your ill health and well-being. And then you were referred to something that's happening in the community or voluntary sector. That could be individual activities, it could be group activities, it could be some of those social services that I mentioned. And I think really importantly, and this speaks to what Matthew was talking about earlier, there's follow-up and tracking. So we start to get a sense of what are the impacts on health and the use of health services and the experience of engaging in health care on people, right? How are we doing? What are the impacts on ourselves? What are the impacts on our communities? What are the impacts on our use of health services? And then that's how we learn, right? So we'll be able to start better measuring and capturing and speaking back to the health system about the health benefits of engagement in things like the arts. So, one of the most transformative components of social prescribing is that work of self-determination and that co-production of health between the person and that link worker, which really helps us shift away from asking what's the matter with you and starting to ask what matters to you, and really building that connection. And for many people, that will be engagement in arts and culture. So this is the work of what we would call self-determination, which has a number of different components. If you're interested in reading up a little bit more, I have a popular media article in The Conversation that features lots of art in the article, and you can check it out. But really, it's about individually and sort of politically or collectively that we are able to demonstrate our autonomy, our ability to make decisions for ourselves, our competence to remind ourselves that we can do things, we can have impacts in the world, our beneficence, or our ability to give back to our communities. And I think very importantly, our relatedness, our sense of belonging in the world. These four components are really important to the work of social prescribing. And I want to highlight them here, partly because when it comes to interacting with art, and in museums in particular, we need to be aware of the power relations that are inherent in those dynamics. That cultural safety, for example, if you're an Indigenous person encountering an art museum that includes artifacts that were stolen from your community or from your own family, you may not experience the same impact. You will not experience the same impact as somebody who comes from a settler community or somebody who comes from another country and is not cognizant of our history here in Canada. So decolonizing approaches are increasingly important to our museum sector, to our arts sector, and they're very important to social prescribing because we want to make sure that we're creating safe spaces in which people can build their health and well-being, and in which we're supporting health equity. So it's very important. And, the research out of the Art Gallery of Ontario has shown that the three things keeping people from going to the art gallery are access, right? The cost of entry or cultural barriers to entry if you're from a community that doesn't typically engage. Representation, seeing yourself and your interests and your communities in the art that's being displayed and curated. And support. And I think one of the most telling examples of the support is that people report that they don't know what to wear. They don't know how to be, how to act, what to wear, what feels comfortable in the museum setting. So there's a lot of work we need to do in order to make sure that the work we're doing around social prescribing and the arts is welcoming to people and supports their health, which isn't to say that it always needs to be comfortable. There will be components of engagement with art that are uncomfortable and still health promoting. But at the same time, we need to be very thoughtful about the way we're doing this. And so I want to point you to one piece, a relatively new piece here by Nicole Ritchie that gets into this work in particular and is well worth a read. So in addition to being an intervention at that individual level, it's also a systems intervention. And this is the part that really drives me. I'm interested in growing the work of social prescribing across Canada. And so we have a collective impact project happening now, bringing together organizations that represent communities facing specific barriers to health and well-being. Organizations representing arts and culture. You can see we have a national community of practice linking together major arts and cultural organizations. We have a student collective. We've got various healthcare organizations and community organizations, all coming together to co-design and co-produce what we think social prescribing could be in our country. As James mentioned, I'm also part of the Flourish Community Engaged Arts and Social Wellness Research Collaborative, where we're starting to do more research about how we can be using the arts for health and well-being and social change at that community scale. So so Matthew already mentioned Daisy Fancourt's work. It's really important setting the evidence base for how social prescribing or how arts in particular can impact our health and well-being. It can impact us psychologically, but also physiologically, also socially, also behaviorally. There is that strong evidence that we're onto something here, that we know some of this intuitively, but capturing the evidence is very important to our ability to do this work well, to do it safely, and to scale and spread it. So one of the examples here is, around how arts can impact not only health promotion, but ongoing treatment. So we have a project here in Toronto through Toronto Metropolitan University called the Sing Well Project. And it's for people experiencing communications challenges. And we have one participant who said, at this point, I don't feel like my Parkinson's defines me as much as it used to. Now that I've been singing with a group for a while, I feel that I'm also a singer who's part of a vibrant community. And this feedback is something you're going to hear over and over again, that sense of belonging, one of those key components of self-determination, is something that's emerged as something very important to the work of social prescribing and the arts. Here's another example that's from the Art Gallery of Ontario, and my colleague Melissa Smith, who is the assistant curator for arts and well-being and community inclusion at the AGO, has done a number of really interesting projects. We know, for example, from Dr. Fancourt's work, older adults who participate in community arts are 20% less likely to develop a physical disability, 25% reduction in chronic pain. Those are really significant numbers that can compete with almost any physical health intervention. And so for one example, at the Art Gallery of Ontario, something called Choose Health, where the art gallery partnered with a local community health center and created a peer-led museum experience for people with chronic pain. And here peers who themselves are living with chronic pain were trained to take their colleagues and their friends around the art gallery and do a mediated interactive art experience. And this really helps, again, with that sense of belonging, that sense of knowing how to be in the museum when you have a peer who can bring you around. So this is one thing that's happening here in Toronto. And Dr. Fancourt's work also shows that people who attend cultural programs regularly are much less likely to develop depression. And new mothers participating in singing groups can reduce their symptoms of postpartum depression by 40%. Again, these are really big numbers. And so one example here in Toronto is the Lullaby Project, put on through Massey Hall and Roy Thompson Hall, which are music venues, in collaboration with Carnegie Hall in New York, on getting young mothers who require support with bonding with their infants and creating a range of wraparound supports. They're involved in developing lullabies for their children. And again, there's a component of empowerment in which these moms are, again, creating, singing, recording these lullabies and keeping them on the record for posterity, sharing them with others. So they're able to be reminded of their own self-efficacy, give back to their communities, and have an impact in the world. And so the impacts for them have been really transformative in terms of their own sense of health and well-being and capacity in the world. Just another quick example from the Art Gallery of Ontario. This is art making by older adults. Again, the most important impact, this is assessed at 2 different times during their art making and art interaction experiences, that we see an improvement in group belonging. Again, belonging, something's going on here when we're doing this work with other people. And we see also improvements in attention, in pleasure, in self-esteem, and, not that much going on in the way of negative affect, although, of course, there's nothing that will be inherently comfortable all the time for all of us. Another example from singing is a choir called Voices in Motion in Victoria, British Columbia, on the west coast of Canada. Again, showing a number of really interesting and positive results about choral singing for people with dementia, really activating parts of the brain that are not affected by dementia. And again, reminding us, tapping into our capacity, focusing more on what's strong than on what's wrong. So this is a video that's actually out of the UK, and I'm part of that Global Social Prescribing Alliance. And it's a very brief video, but it's about that singing for dementia, and it's just really lovely. So I'm going to press play here, and I hope the volume works and you'll be able to watch along with me.
We all know how important it is to support people with long-term health conditions with their well-being. And I'm here today to see one of the rehearsals for our dementia choir, which is doing just that. And it's also a great example of social prescribing in action. So Karen, can you tell us a little bit about our dementia choir?
So our dementia choir, originally set up by the BBC and Vicky McClure, but changed to a charity probably a year ago to give people who are living with dementia, their carers, their families, a safe space to come and enjoy, sing. Live music brings everybody alive.
So what do you think the power of music is for people living with long-term health conditions?
It's just amazing, and it's a lovely atmosphere. We uplift each other.
I actually start feeling better about things like a day or two before one of these sessions, and it goes on for a day or two after the session's finished, It's really quite staggering.
What have you noticed in terms of the benefits of the choir for your mum?
She absolutely loves it, if I'm honest. She really, really, and it's helped me, Laura and Katie, I think. We're meeting a family with the dementia choir and everybody's in the same boat and they are so welcoming and we can all share things with each other.
So Kate, you are a social prescribing link worker. Tell us about your role.
We're there to give an holistic approach for people, to support them and guide them into what is out there for them. We're based in GP practices, but we'll connect up with whoever we can out in the community and other places to help people.
You've actually referred a few people into the choir in your role. Seeing them today and listening to them sing, what do you think the impact of music and being in this group has been for them?
It's just lovely to see some of them today, how they've blossomed, come into the choir and just to see their smiling faces and to see that they're chatting with others and they're living well with dementia, which is what it's all about.
So what would you say to someone who's thinking about getting involved in an activity like a community choir, for example, for their health and well-being?
You need to just do it. It's amazing. It'll change your life and you will make friends. People need to know about everything that's out there. I love it and I know my mum is just loving it too.
Just go and do it. Just go and try it. Get a social prescriber to actually signpost you to something that's relevant to you.
You'd be surprised how much you'll enjoy it and how you integrate with people. It's helped me live my life.
What do you think life would be like without the choir?
I can't bear thinking about it. I love the dementia choir. It brings me joy, great joy.
I don't think Mick would be here today if it wasn't for the choir. His eyes light up. You know, I get Mick's eyes back, not the dementia eyes.
So that's the dementia choir. And I think, you know, that message that to just do it is really about what social prescribing is trying to do, which is connect people to what's already out there. There's all kinds of great stuff already out there. Many of you on this call today are leading very interesting arts and health and well-being work. So that's partly what we're trying to do through the Canadian Institute for Social Prescribing, is to be a focal point for social prescribing in Canada and for Canadian social prescribing in the world, where we're now one of more than 20 countries, including the US, implementing social prescribing in different places and in different ways. We're very much committed to foregrounding health equity, community leadership, and collaboration in this work. And we just want to be there to share and celebrate and connect people doing really important work. And of course, to keep building momentum for policy and practice change so we can see this happening at that systems level here in Canada. Very briefly, we've got all kinds of interesting work going on around the evidence for social prescribing, what models look like, what priority populations say they want and need from social prescribing, and how ready we are to implement this at the policy level. And we've got a lot of different communities of practice and communities of interest helping us to think about social prescribing together. If you want to know about what the practice looks like in Canada, you can go to this link here, and maybe I'll pop it into the chat later on so that you can listen to some people. There are even some demonstrations. You can get involved with the National Ballet School of Canada, who lead through a dance activity, and there's all kinds of really interesting stuff in this webinar here. So I will share it in the chat afterward. This video is even briefer than the other. This is from one of our pieces of work here in Ontario with community health centers, where social prescribing looks very different depending on the kind of community you're in. If you're in a rural and remote community compared to an urban community, older adults versus young families and so on, they're going to look different. So this is from Temiskaming, which is a very remote community in Northern Ontario, where the majority of people are English speakers, but there's a very small number of Francophones or French speakers who required special supports developed through community development to do social prescribing. So here's what it looks like there.
5% de les clients ont rapporté au moins une amélioration dans leur vie personnelle, donc que ce soit quelque chose comme plus satisfaite avec leur relation, que si c'était quelque chose comme oh, j'ai plus de gens à dépendre dessus pour des raisons comme des rendez-vous ou autre chose dans leur vie personnelle.
And I have one more little clip from that same video that I want to share with you. Here it is.
connexion humaine est très, très, très importante, presque primordiale à ces temps-ci qu'on est dans une pandémie.
On prend les gens là où ils sont pour essayer de leur donner un peu de soleil dans leur vie. Parce que l'activité est je dirais une excuse pour se rencontrer, mais c'est le social qui est la raison d'être de toutes nos activités.
So that's social prescribing and belonging here in Canada. Thanks so much for having me here with you.
Thank you, Kate. That was terrific. Thank you for your wonderful work, and thank you for sharing it with us today. Really, really inspiring. So now let's get into the in conversation portion of our colloquium. And Matthew, I'd like to start by inviting you to comment on what Kate just shared with us. Based on your experience as a museum researcher, what strikes you as particularly valuable about the work that Kate is doing?
I mean, honestly speaking, I think all of it is amazingly valuable. And I have to say, looking at the work we're trying to do in Austria, especially, I think you're a model for what we're essentially aspiring to do, especially looking at the role of link workers and mediating and bringing together, different sectors of society to the arts and in different contexts for different ends. I think it's amazing, and I was very excited to see that even the work you were talking about covers a wide gamut from arts and making you feel better, but also bringing you into a sense of community, giving you an outlet for creativity. These are all things that we're talking about here. And I guess I would start with a very basic question that I'm struggling with myself, and we're trying to come up with good answers. But I was struck by your comment or your quote about we need to move from what's the matter with you, to what matters to you. And especially when we're talking about the different roles that the arts can play, one of the things that I think I sort of struggle with, or I'm trying to come up with a solution to, is basically from the bottom up, but also maybe top down, completely radically changing what the arts are and what role they play in culture and society, especially at the level of an everyday member of a city or of a particular community. And I'm wondering if you have any ideas of how do we start to do that, and how do we start to we talk a lot about moving from the institution is a receptacle of important things that you should go to because it's good for you, to a receptacle of things that might be useful to you in some capacity. And I just would be interested to hear what if you have ideas in that direction.
I do. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, and the question that we encounter every day in social prescribing practice. What matters to you, and how do we help you get to where you want to be? And how do we compare where you want to be with what we know or don't know, or what we have to offer or don't have to offer? So, it's complex, but our perspective, I think, is that we act on the evidence that we do have. We know there's strong evidence when it comes to arts and health, for example. And there may be a need to build more of an evidence base around what is the right model of social prescribing that connects you there, and so on. But that doesn't mean there isn't evidence for the overall intervention being probably good for us. We know this. We know physical activity is going to be good for us. Healthy eating is going to be good for us. Engaging with the arts, good for us. So we're going to build on that. So I think that the most important component of really engaging everyday folks in the arts is that work, that focus on self-determination, and that focus on peers. The link worker as your peer, co-producing with you. Even the idea of co-production, it's a creative process, that engaging and making decisions about your own health is an act of creativity. You're going to imagine a new future for yourself. You're going to think about what's there. You're going to bring your own capacity to the conversation. And I myself have experienced this form of healthcare. For example, having a midwife when I had my children, that really put me in the driver's seat of my own healthcare in a way that I did not ever experience in biomedical healthcare that was physician-led, for example. So we know that it can, through experience, that this can be really transformative for people. So I think that that focus on what matters to you, that's really facilitated in this in a safe and peer-based way, holds a lot of promise. And so we need to continue investigating that. And I'm particularly interested in what happens to that work of co-production. What if we do scale it up and we start being asked to do co-production or given lots of money for co-production? Is that the same thing as when we're doing it from the grassroots or when you've got a lot of control over your research studies in particular locations? So there's lots of more questions, but I think there's some really promising opportunities too.
Very interesting. If I could just jump in here, I'm just thinking about how, kind of from a historical perspective, how the provenance of much art is, religion. And so the religious funding of art, but then also meaning and valuing and purpose of art. And then as that has shifted in many places in the world. And so cathedrals in Europe are oftentimes feel almost more like museums in many ways than they do like churches, although there's still a function of the religious there. But then there's this, there's a sense of maybe the art historical. And that's a really rich way of understanding and studying art. And so museums, I think, have traditionally taken on that role of kind of the art historical. And I think what both of you are talking about is maybe another transformation where we say, well, not taking anything away from the value of art for religion or for art historical reasons, but surely that's not all that art can do. And what happens if we think about art from the standpoint of well-being, not just from a small group of people or persons in power, but from everyone? So it's kind of a democratic well-being kind of revolution, and both from the standpoint of the enjoyment and participation, but also from the production of art and what all that means. Does those reflections resonate with either of you?
Yeah, just to jump in completely. And I think that's one of the things that we're sort of aspiring to, especially with some of the museum partners we have, is basically from the ground up changing the attitude about at the level of someone who might excuse me, visit a museum. So as you said, of course, there's many reasons why a museum exists and why you would collect certain artworks, and some of them are historical, some of them have other reasons. But when you start communicating, I think, to a member of a society of like, why is this here now, and what could you do with it? There's so many more possibilities, especially if we think about how we're communicating. Go there and maybe you'll find something that it has historical importance and raises a lot of questions and makes you want to follow that avenue. Maybe there's something that just makes you feel restored and feel good and feel invigorated. Maybe there's something that will stick in your mind a little bit and make you question a bit of something in the way you see the world. And I think all of those different possibilities, if there's a way, and I don't know what this is, but if there's a way to sort of make that open at the level of someone who, say, visits a new city or decides on a Sunday, you know what, I think I want to go see art or culture today, and have that maybe one of the first things that comes to their mind. Not only because it's aesthetically amazing or intrinsically good for me from a historical or cultural perspective, but also something really interesting might happen or beneficial.
I think the other component that's really significant, James, in what you said is around actually the political economy of museums, that, and community supports and services, right? That we've seen such a decline in funding around the world for community supports and to a certain extent for these arts and culture institutions as well, that, you know, frankly, we're looking for other sources of funding and other ways to demonstrate their value. And I would say health and well-being are one of the few non-economic sources of value that are still recognized widely by governments. So, of course, we want to show economic value there too. We need to show that this is going to reduce our use of expensive health services and acute care and all that stuff. And that's a big part of what we're trying to do, is build that evidence base and use that evidence base. But a lot of it's just around, okay, showing that it's healthy is another way of showing that there's something good in it.
Mhm.
And so it's our, you know, if in another era, it was about demonstrating that this is related to religion, which was maybe the most powerful ideology. And now it's more, you know, it's capital. That's our driving ideology. Okay, we can speak to why it's important to that. And in a new era, it will be something else. And we'll continue to build evidence around, you know, and the actual experience of and impact of engagement with art might not change a lot during that. So that's a big part of what I'm doing, is trying to recognize that what do people who make decisions and have money want to know, and demonstrate that so that the people who are doing good work can do the good work.
I love that, Kate. One of the former directors of the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, Natalie Bondil, once said, I'm not going to get the quote exactly right, but it's something along the lines of that she is as hopeful and expects that in the 21st century, we'll be able to understand arts and culture as foundational to well-being, just as in the 20th century, we found physical exercise to be foundational to well-being, right? So if you think about 100 years ago, people weren't convinced that exercise was necessarily a good thing, especially for women. You know, that could be really, really dangerous. But over the course of the 20th century, thankfully, we have learned a lot. Attitudes have changed. A large part of this has been the scientific evidence. And so people now realize that exercise of various sorts, you know, can be helpful. Kate, I was struck with how usefully and liberally you cited evidence in your piece, largely from the work of Daisy Van Court. I'm curious now, as you listened to what Matthew was presenting, what were some of the things that struck you about his approach?
Well, first of all, I'm very grateful for it because it's a really important part of what, you know, building the case to decision makers to do this work. And we also have to do it with integrity. And so to make sure that we're not making claims about the evidence that aren't there. And so that was, I think, really struck me, that I'm just happy that you're doing this work and sharing it. But also, I think there were a couple of things. One was around this sort of the universal components, the things that you found weren't culturally specific when you looked in different parts of the world. Because in the work in equity, I think that specificity around people and culture and power relations is so central to what we're doing that sometimes we don't look as often enough at that, what might be universal across different cultures. So I would love to hear more about that and how we can start really talking about what those benefits are across cultures and across social locations.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much. I think, personally speaking, one of the more powerful implications of this. So I think we have the pragmatic and the maybe more theoretical. On the pragmatic side of things, it is very specific. I mean, we do need to talk about, you know, who are you and what do you bring to this encounter, and how do you resonate with this particular work of art? And that's incredibly important, especially when, for example, if we can build it up to prescribing certain engagements with the arts and culture. But I think at the same time, I would strongly argue that why would we expect that humans would have different, you know, psychological paths we would go down at a very basic level of, you know, does it make you angry, or does it reinforce what you thought about the world, or does something about it transform, you know, your worldview? And I think that one of the more interesting implications there is we can start talking about what does bring us together, and what role does the arts play as sort of a universal object that we're responding to in very different ways, but we're responding similarly. And I think it also, some of the work that we're hoping to do going forward now is say, go into different communities and drop the word art and start looking at the outcome and ask, you know, like, okay, tell us today, was there something that you found transformative? Or was there something that you found like visually pleasurable, or that somehow resonated with how you were feeling. And then what is that? And I think that would really expand the possibilities also for the work we're doing and you're doing as well, because it may not be, you know, a painting in a museum. Especially, I think Canada is an amazing example with very different communities. It may be something quite different that's the same key fitting into the same lock, but you know, it's very different at the specific level.
I want to ask one more question, and then I'll open it up to anyone in the audience who would like to ask a question or make a comment. Feel free to raise your Zoom hand when you're ready for that, and we'll turn to you. So the question that I have, I want to start, Matthew, with your analysis and your model, where you talked about 4 different outcomes, you know, the facile outcome and the negative outcome, which I'm, you know, assuming we can kind of leave aside for one moment. But then there's the harmonious and the transformative. And I'm really interested in the kind of contrast between those in a way where it seems like the harmonious is kind of like aligned with who we are or what we expect and so forth. And so there may not be so much room for change or transformation because it just kind of reinforces who we are. And then, you know, watching those amazing videos that Kate was showing us, that felt to me like maybe cases of transformation by harmony, literally in the terms of music, right? Sorry. But that sense of, and you know, thinking about positive psychology and the approach of positive psychology saying, you know, when we, I love that other line that you had, Kate, about, you know, what's strong as opposed to what's wrong, right? And I wonder if, Matthew, there are pathways to transformation, not only through what's wrong or what's jarring or what's different, but also through what's harmonious if we stay with them and we understand them as opportunities for real growth, not just as opportunities for patting ourselves on the back because we've got it all figured out. Curious what you think of that.
Yeah, I completely agree. So especially at the level of a theoretical model, I'd like to make a distinction between what happens within, if you can sort of bracket off one engagement with art, say you're standing there and you're looking, right? There's a discussion of what happens there, and then there's a discussion of what happens after that. And I fully agree. Some of the work that we're looking at is, of course, it can be transformative in the moment, and it's either harmonious or transformative, and those are very different because one is, you know, resonating and self-reinforcing, and the other is self-questioning. But at the same time, when you walk away from that experience, you're probably fundamentally different, especially if you have a very profound, resonant, you know, powerful experience, because now you're a person who's had that experience, and you might seek out more, or you might have a stronger sense of somehow togetherness or understanding of say the artist who made this, or the community that made it possible, or even yourself. One thing we find is one of the best predictors of people having very powerful experiences with a work of art is asking them if they've ever had a profound experience with a work of art in their past. At the same time, the transformative experience doesn't also have to happen in the moment. There's some of the researchers we work with who are phenomenologists and conduct more interview-based studies, you know, report someone who maybe went into a museum and saw something that just sort of they couldn't understand, and it stuck with them, and it didn't make them feel like they had somehow controlled or mastered their engagement, and then say maybe signed up for half a year of art history classes to try to understand what was it about this thing that stuck with me, and I want to go back and keep revisiting it and see if I can like work through it and understand it. So yeah, I think there's, especially from the standpoint of positive psychology and say flow experiences, that might push you a little beyond who you are now. I mean, it doesn't radically disrupt who you are, but it maybe opens the possibility that you could be even more than you are, for example.
Yeah, I love that, Matthew. And in a second, I'll turn to you for your thoughts, Kate, on this. I love that because I think oftentimes, I think leaving either out is probably like leaving too much out, right? And so sometimes we're just like, oh, I don't want to go and feel bad. I don't want to go and get jarred. I don't want to go and get my world rocked. Well, then you're missing out on a lot because there's a lot more, you know, in the world. there's much more in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy, to quote a line from Hamlet, from Shakespeare. So, and the other side of it, I think oftentimes we're almost most ignorant about our strengths oftentimes, because we just like, well, I don't have to worry about that. Like that's, or there's such a thing as strengths blindness. I don't even know that that's something I'm good at until somebody says to me like, you do that pretty darn well. I'm like, I do, right? So sometimes there can be that, exactly that growth and transformation if we stick with the harmonious beyond just the pat on the back, yeah, I got it. So Kate, I'm curious in your work and in the some of the examples you were sharing with us, do you see a balance there, or like how do you see that playing out?
I actually have a new question. I hope that's okay, James, before we get to the group, because I think it plays into this conversation as well. And it's really around, Matthew, what you've learned from doing stuff online. Compared to in person. This is something that's really of interest in this, like, whatever we are in, late pandemic era, but also in the Canadian context, where we have some super resource communities like Toronto and some highly remote communities with very little. So what can, thinking back to that same question, what does it look like when we filter it through in person compared to online experiences?
I will say that our research on this was driven by COVID, when all the museums closed, and we're looking for avenues to do research. And I'll also make a call out to a PhD student who's working in our lab, Mackenzie Trop, and this is really the research that she's championed. But yeah, at the level of, does it make you feel better? Does it reduce loneliness? Does it reduce anxiety? Does it increase your sense of well-being? It seems like, so for example, we've done the study where we send people to Google Arts and Culture and look at a Monet. And we're just completing, although we've done some past studies, looking at, okay, what if we do a very similar Monet in the gallery? It seems like the effects are pretty similar, I have to say. We're doing a follow-up now, and we're trying to tease out, well, okay, when does it happen, say, if you go to the museum? Is it when you enter and walk up the stairs of this grand, amazing staircase? Is it when you've actually gone into the room and come back out? So there's all sorts of new questions. So I think as far as prescribing, there's really exciting evidence that it does work. It works with, say, one work of art, it works with a few minutes. And so it raises all sorts of exciting possibilities for microdosing, or really targeting little hits of art throughout the day. At the level of transforming your worldview, on one hand, I would say, why wouldn't it be possible? The way we engage with culture and art is probably social media most days, and you can certainly have your world rock that way. I think there are a lot of the aspects of the grandeur and the sense of importance and the sense of making a special trip and being in a social public space that, there are a lot of elements to being there that are probably also very important. And yeah, it needs more research in that domain, I think. I don't know if you would speak to that as well, or if you have any comment. Kate.
Well, we did the same thing during COVID. Everybody pivoted to doing what they could online. And yeah, I think our experience was a bit mixed in the sense that what we felt we could do, actually what we could do was much greater than what we thought we'd be able to do early on. And people would have preferred to be in person still. I think there's still that sense, whether or not that is borne out by the evidence in terms of what really happens. That's the part that I'm still interested in, because my sense is that practitioners especially still really wanted to be in person. They felt that was important in some way. So I think that's where more research would be really helpful. I personally love the idea that we can access people, resources, ideas, works of art that are far from where we are, and really make this much more of a global possibility. And so being able to engage with works that are in Vienna when you're in Nunavut in northern Canada is really cool, right? And then maybe you'd be able to share your traditional Inuit ways of seeing the world through art with people in Vienna. Like, it's just really interesting, and I'm hopeful and heartened, I guess, by your findings that we could be really onto something with the online approaches.
I think that's one of the gifts of the pandemic, as it were, because that in our Humanities and Human Flourishing project, we also had to pivot to online things, and Catherine Cotter led some really interesting research projects using a virtual platform, and I think that art museums aren't fully going to go back of course, to what they were before. There's too much richness here, and we need to more, we need to learn more about it. With that, let's turn to our audience and see if there are folks who would like to ask a question or make a comment. Liza, I see your hand raised, so why don't you lead us off? Welcome.
Thank you, and phenomenal as always. And I have a question relevant to that last point made, and I will reference what we are building here at the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia, which is an LXP, or a learning experience platform, which was in large part, a response to pandemic era art education and access. And the idea being, we are digitizing and have digitized much of our collection, both object-based and the permanent collection at the brushstroke level, so that the idea being to invite other institutions to join an ecosystem of kind of an arts hub, so that collections can be enjoyed. And this is a different way of enjoying, and I'm asking this just both for Matt and Kate, kind of what are the variables in which, that do draw both people into an experience and make for that valued experience in and around kind of the quote gallery. One feature, and then I will stop and just kind of get your sense of what research opportunities could be here, is the ability to both explore on one's own and kind of get a panoramic sense of what you're doing in gallery, and also bring in elements from other galleries as you're kind of gazing at the moment, the artwork in front of you. And or you could kind of choose to focus on a facilitator or a gallerist or a curatorial or tour, a more guided experience. But wondering both your reaction to that type of experience, coming off of Kate's question for Matt, and what you think, how aligned it is with your findings to date as far as well-being.
Over to you, Matthew.
Yeah, great question. I mean, that's really the next big question, right? I know we've sort of borrowed Daisy Fancourt's terminology of, okay, we need to look at mechanisms for action and active ingredients and what feeds into this, what's really going on under the surface. I think we have a pretty good idea, at least if our theory holds, of what the mechanisms are, but that of course doesn't answer, what do you need to mediate this experience? What can keep you there? What can set you up to really have the most, say you want to maximize the well-being impacts. Some of the work we're looking into right now, or some of the research or ideas we're looking into right now, if you want to change, or if you want to maximize subjective well-being, lower anxiety, improve mood, one idea would be, for example, maybe priming people to look in certain ways. So maybe make them very aware of, say, the formal or the beauty related features of art to really unlock this sense of visual pleasure, or maybe give them the support they need to really get this deep, meaningful experience. And both of those are argued to be mechanisms that might lead to stronger well-being effects. As far as transformative experience, I mean, yeah, there's a lot that can be done, but basically you need to find a way to sort of draw people in and then keep them there. And then at the same time, sort of trap them in an experience that isn't too scary and disruptive, but is a bit, outside their comfort zone. And I think humans have been struggling with how we do that, from a sense of theater, from a sense of like designing a religious building or designing a ritual or a ceremony. Things as simple. One of my favorite examples is a museum years and years ago that had a red carpet across the gallery. And just when people would walk across this red carpet to look at the art, they would stay twice as long. because they've sort of crossed this threshold. And, you know, once you're there and once you're in it, you're like, well, I already crossed the threshold. I should stay here and stick it out. And I think even simple things like that there's so much potential to play with, especially, you know, with institutions that do sort of open their doors and say, hey, let's co-create something together, or let's try different possibilities.
To piggyback on that quickly, we're in our work with HHF, we believe that immersion or that attention is like a gateway mechanism in a way, right? I mean, if people aren't attending to what's going on, or as you started out with, Matthew, you know, 10 to 40 seconds or whatever, you know, for each artwork, then it becomes difficult for people to have a transformative experience, you know, in that amount of time. So finding ways within whatever the platform is, or whether it's a virtual platform or whether it's a brick and mortar platform or experience, to bring people in and encourage them, because you can't forcing them, you know. I mean, I have students that I require to do certain things, and that's good, but it's forced, it's required, this is an assignment, right? So how can you have not just captured audiences, but captivated audiences, and maybe set up situations where there are multiple levels of engagement, right? And so you were talking about kind of beforehand, like what are the expectations going in, and then being there, and then are there ways of, you know, discussing with people afterwards or following up afterwards in some kinds of ways, right? Obviously slow looking, that's something that we've experimented with, and I ask my students to do, and anecdotally the differences, you know, the transformations there are really huge. And that's one thing that I think, Matthew, is a possible way of encouraging people to stick with the harmonious long enough that it can be insightful and transformative, and like, oh, I understand now much more clearly these things that I thought I was well aligned with, but I was only seeing it on a superficial or a surface level, something like that.
And just a small comment to that. I think that also goes back to this idea of what do we communicate to the public and to society. I mean, if you're entering a museum and you have the feeling or the expectation that, you know, I might have a really interesting, powerful, harmonious response, and that's okay, but it's also something that is shared, and a lot of people maybe similarly feel that way, and they don't have to be you know, inside the art world. You don't have to have the right training to be able to feel this way, but you might find something that does make you feel this way.
Yeah,
that might be, you know, a huge step just in itself.
Yeah, terrific. Kate, we'll turn it over to you, and you'll have the last word because we're coming up to the end of our time. So what are your thoughts?
So one thing I've learned from interacting with our, you know, arts and wellness community of practice is that museums and galleries collect a lot more data than I knew, than I ever expected. And I think that's fantastic. And I like knowing that our health and well-being researchers are increasingly involved in that, because my interest is in scaling up, right? I want to see some of this happening at this system scale. I'm very much interested in what we would call learning organizations or learning systems. And so I just want to plant the seed that I think it's time for us to talk about developing some common indicators and some common approaches so that we can tell our story together as a collective, that we, you know, that if it sounds like we're onto something, there are some theoretical and some pragmatic directions that are leading us toward what I think could be some easy to collect indicators about the impacts of the arts and arts institutions on our health and well-being that will help us tell the story at scale to people who control resources and can set directions. And so I'll just plant that seed. I think, Liza, your question really reminded me of that. And I'd love to see further conversations about that as we start building bigger and broader networks all around the world.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kate. It's marvelous to be in this conversation with other people who are so like-minded and are doing such complementary work, right? And so I know that, again, in our HHF context, Catherine Cotter is leading some work specifically along those lines, Kate, to develop modules, core museum surveys, to be able to have numbers that aren't merely economic numbers, which, as you say, are important, but that's not why we have art, right? But to explore more, you know, the impact of empathy, or the impact on meaning, or social connections, and so forth, belonging. So really, really marvelous to have this conversation. It both reaffirms, I think, for all of us that what we're doing is important, and hopefully it kind of opens up the space and allows us to see that there's a lot more going on, not just a lot more data being collected, as you say, Kate, but a lot more going on in this space that we may think of in our day-to-day interaction. So thanks again to Matthew and to Kate for joining us today and giving us such a thoughtful presentation and such insightful discussions. Those of you who are joining, feel free to add any words of thanks that you would like in the chat. As we wrap up here, thanks also to Catherine Cotter and Sarah Sidoti for all of your work behind the scenes to set this program up. And thanks to everyone in the audience for joining us today. It's really been great to have you with us. And we invite you to join us again next month for our next installation of In Conversation. We will be joined by Dr. Rebecca Chamberlain, an award-winning researcher at the University of London, who studies the psychological and neuroscientific basis of artistic perception and production. We'll also be joined by Dana Bishop-Root, who is the Director of Education and Public Programs at the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. That meeting will take place, begin at 10 a.m. Eastern Time on Wednesday, November 16th. And Sarah will drop that registration link in the chat now, so you have it there. Please feel free to pass the word along to anyone you think might be interested in joining us. The more the merrier. If we're going to take over the world, we've got to increase our numbers, so that's exciting. And remember to sign up for our newsletter, or if you'd like to sign up for our newsletter or just find out more about the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project, please visit our website at www.humanities&humanflourishing.org. So it's www.humanities&humanflourishing.org. So thank you so much. It was wonderful to be with you all. Thank you and be well.